Good morning, everyone. Welcome. I'm Dr. Brad Roberts, the director of the Center for Global Security Research, and it's my pleasure to welcome you here today to a discussion with Dr. Vipin Narang on his new book, Seeking the Bomb: Strategies of Nuclear Proliferation. I'll let Vipin set his own context here. The subject is self-evidently significant, particularly as we move more and more into a world where the foundations of the old order are eroding, bringing new questions about the nature of the emerging nuclear order, such as it might be. And Vipin has spoken a number of times to our group about his prior book projects, and I know interest in this one is high. For those who don't know him, Dr. Narang is Frank Stanton Professor of Nuclear Security and Political Science and a member of the Security Studies Program at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. He has previously been a fellow at Harvard University's Olin Institute for Strategic Studies, a postdoctoral fellow at Harvard's Belfer Center, a Stanton Junior Faculty Fellow at Stanford University's Center for International Security and Cooperation. He received his BS and master's degree in chemical engineering from Stanford and a master's in philosophy with distinction in international relations from Balliol College, Oxford. And he has a PhD in government from Harvard. Vipin, thanks so much for making the time to do this. Let me explain to the group. Today's session will be truncated from our norm. We have 60 minutes today rather than 90. So Vipin plans to speak for 15 to 20 minutes, and then we'll open it up to Q&A. Please get your hands raised early so that I can get the conversation rolling as soon as he's finished. But if you prefer to send a message in the chat function, please send it my way, and I'll try and put it into play. Vipin, thanks so much. Over to you.
Thanks, Brad. Really grateful to you for organizing this, and Katie for all of her help. It's always a pleasure to meet the group at Lawrence Livermore. I'm a Bay Area kid, grew up in the South Bay. It's always a special treat. I wish we could be there in person. I never miss a chance to come back home. So today I'm going to give a very brief overview of the book, and here's the shameless self-promotion part: Seeking the Bomb: Strategies of Nuclear Proliferation. And it just came out with Princeton University Press. And it really sort of asks the question about how states, once they sort of decide they have some interest potentially in nuclear weapons, how do they go about pursuing them? And I don't want to bore you with sort of the death by PowerPoint and the talk I would give to an academic political science audience, because this audience is well aware of sort of the technologies and the proliferators historically. And most of the literature in our field in political science is focused for the last 20 years on why states want nuclear weapons. And the motivation for the book was really that debate has gotten stale. And, from a practical perspective, is not terribly relevant. We can litigate till the cows come home why a state might want nuclear weapons. Question is, once it decides it wants it for, may want it for whatever reason, then the world and the U.S. in particular are confronted with a potential proliferation challenge. And frankly, the motivations can help sort of maybe stall the state. Oftentimes, though, the motivations are many. It's not just security. Often it's prestige and domestic politics and bureaucracies. And so divining a single sort of cause for why states want nuclear weapons, and I think has occupied a lot of and killed a lot of trees in our discipline. But I think equally important is sort of the how question. And this book was an attempt to sort of open up a research agenda and thinking about sort of the how question. And I think it makes a couple of points. I don't know how important the points are, but I think some novel points for some food for thought. First, it sort of folds the concept of nuclear hedging back into sort of the proliferation process. It's often treated hedgers, those states who have not yet decided whether they want the bomb or not, but lay the foundation and groundwork for a bomb option with some sort of fissile material production capability, either from a civilian nuclear energy or potentially covert or clandestine enrichment technologies and facilities, haven't really decided whether they want a nuclear weapon qua weapons yet, but want to put the pieces in place so that if they decide that they want nuclear weapons in the future, it sort of shortens their pathway to nuclear weapons and also their window of vulnerability to potential coercers who may try to stop them. And the book really centrally locates hedgers as an important waypoint on the pathway to nuclear proliferation. Most states, other than the initial sort of proliferators, pass through a hedging phase where they're still debating and litigating, whether they want nuclear weapons or not. A second sort of a point that the book highlights is what regulates that decision from keeping a bomb option open to actually wanting nuclear weapons and pursuing nuclear weapons is a domestic political process where the veto players at home have to decide and agree that nuclear weapons are the solution to their security problems. Uh, some states have open debate about whether they want nuclear weapons or not. Hedgers like Sweden, Sweden went very far, much farther than I think the general public, but I'm sure many people here are aware, in terms of developing the foundation for a military nuclear weapons program. But in the 1960s, as Prime Minister Erlander and the Swedish government was reaching the point of, the decision point on whether to actually develop nuclear weapons, they had a very public debate. The NPT was looming, and Sweden essentially decided to forswear the option and join the NPT and became a champion essentially of, non-proliferation. But the process that Sweden endured, the domestic political debate and deciding, and trying to build domestic consensus from between the military, the scientific bureaucracies, and the political leadership for nuclear weapons, is sort of replicated across a variety of states that have not yet decided whether they want nuclear weapons or not. India is a sort of a textbook case where the domestic political decision to weaponize their latent nuclear capability took 15 years. And it isn't that Indian scientists were incompetent or slow, it was that the political leadership had not yet decided until 1989 that nuclear weapons were sort of the only remaining answer to their security predicament against Pakistan and China. So bringing domestic politics as sort of the key regulator between most hedgers and active weaponizers is sort of one of the key points of the book, and that's how it sort of unifies hedgers along the proliferation process. You have to pass through. You have the security threat. You sort of leave this bomb option open, but it's really a domestic policy decision to decide to go from keeping the option open to exercising the option, and that process is not trivial. Another point related to hedgers that I think is important to the book is there are different types of hedgers. Hedgers sort of get treated in the classic Elie Levite article on hedgers, those who want to keep the bomb option open, as sort of, all kind of the same. But I find that there are some key differences systematically between types of hedgers in history and going forward. The first type is sort of the latent nuclear capable states, what I call the technical hedgers, where they have the foundation either because of a civilian nuclear program or because they made, like Argentina and Brazil, flirt with enrichment for a naval propulsion program. No real political will for nuclear weapons, but you sort of get a temptation to start thinking about what you might be able to do with this technology. And there's no real centralized intent for nuclear weapons, but the basis is there. The other key distinction is sort of between allies and adversaries who are hedging. Turns out most of our allies, our formal allies under the extended nuclear umbrella, have latent nuclear programs and have nuclear hedges. Japan, South Korea got caught several times, Taiwan, West Germany was sort of the big problem in the Cold War was how do you keep West Germany non-nuclear? And it took sort of a West German hedge to convince the US to engage in nuclear sharing at levels that are sort of unprecedented, even to this day. But Japan, as all of you know, has you know double-digit tons of reactor-grade plutonium under sovereign control, roughly 9 to 10 on its soil, and sort of flirts with the idea of nuclear weapons privately when it needs a greater reassurance from the United States. And the Allies have what I call insurance hedging, which is they develop they have the basis of a potential nuclear weapons program, and threaten to sort of break out or exercise it privately with the US, maybe even publicly, in order to elicit greater reassurance and extended deterrence guarantees from the United States. And Japan has a long storied history of doing this since very early on in the Cold War, 1960s and 70s, and even through today. West Germany did it to extract essentially nuclear sharing. And there's the key point here is that the Allies have their hedge to sort of elicit greater reassurance, but also to hedge against potential abandonment from the United States. So having the hedge sort of closes and narrows their window of vulnerability to the common threat, China or the Soviet Union, in the event that they face US abandonment or perceived US abandonment. And so that kind of hedging is very different from sort of the Swedish and Indian hedges, which were, really motivated by an external threat. There wasn't a formal ally. And the decision about whether to go nuclear or not was sort of this domestic political decision about whether to exercise the option or not. And those are who I call hard hedgers. These are probably the most uh, uh, concerning types of hedgers from a non-proliferation standpoint because they stand on the precipice of pursuing nuclear weapons and maybe one leadership decision away from doing so. And so uh, these types of hedgers hedge for different reasons. They'll break out for different reasons. The indicators for when and why they may decide to fully pursue an active nuclear weapons program are different. One, the insurance hedgers and our allies are watching out for US abandonment, for a lack of perceived extended deterrence guarantees, whereas adversaries or sort of non-formal allies or friends of the United States are really looking inward. It's really a domestic political decision that drives whether they believe internally that they want to sort of bear the burden of possessing nuclear weapons in the modern era. So those are the hedgers. Once a state decides to actively pursue nuclear weapons, I identify three different sort of proliferation strategies. One is sort of the stylized strategy in at least the political science literature, which is sort of the sprinting, that every state that pursues nuclear weapons has a Manhattan Project. They do it openly. They try to get a nuclear weapons capability as quickly as possible. And while that may have characterized the US, the Soviet Union, maybe Britain to some extent, China, it really doesn't travel very far beyond the first several proliferators who had sort of, they operated in an era where non-proliferation wasn't a growing norm. Counter-proliferation capabilities from adversaries were very weak. They had large territories where they could hide or immunize their facilities from, kinetic attack. The Chinese, there was significant debate within the Johnson administration about whether to try to prevent China from developing nuclear weapons. And the fundamental problem was being able to destroy the facilities in Mongolia would require essentially a full-scale, air operation that would risk a broad war with China, and you're not even sure that you can get all of the facilities and any nuclear weapons that you may not even know about. So the sprinting strategy is available to states, but because of the sequencing of who pursued and developed nuclear weapons in the early phases of the Cold War, there aren't many potential sprinters left. Maybe Australia, sort of my poster boy for a potential sprinter. If Australia decided it wanted nuclear weapons, it sort of has large buffers because of the Pacific Ocean. It's not really threatening. China probably wouldn't be able to destroy it. The U.S. would probably, it may not be happy about it, but probably wouldn't try and destroy it. And Australia could probably have an open, quick march to nuclear weapons. But other states and most states in the system don't have that luxury. And that the states now that want to pursue nuclear weapons are the very states that the international system and the U.S. in particular does not want to have nuclear weapons. And so that forces the remaining proliferators to develop creative strategies of proliferation. And there are really two that have been prominent historically. One is what I call sheltered pursuit. So you think of Pakistan in the 1980s, North Korea in the 1990s and early 2000s, who both developed and cultivated uh, great power shelter. In the Pakistani case, the United States; in the North Korean case, China, uh, where the great power essentially deterred preventive action by the common adversary. So, Pakistan, we relied on Pakistan in the first Afghan war in the 1980s, and the Reagan administration essentially turned a blind eye to the Pakistani nuclear program. And Pakistan availed itself of that sort of shelter to pursue nuclear weapons before India could stop it. There was even a perverse incentive. Pakistan had incentives to sort of drag out the Afghan war to buy itself greater shelter and time to get to the finish line. North Korea probably doesn't get, in my reading, and this is certainly debatable, probably doesn't get to the finish line if it doesn't have Chinese shelter. Now, it's not that China necessarily wanted North Korea to have nuclear weapons, but it preferred a nuclear North Korea to collapse North Korea. And China was running interference at the UN in the six-party talks, obfuscating about the centrifuge program when it was discovered in the early 2000s. And China went to pretty significant lengths to sort of immunize North Korea from US and Western coercion on the nuclear program. And for a state that can cultivate this external shelter, if it happens to be the US, it almost never fails. It really sort of prevents the international community from being able to coerce the state into giving up its nuclear program or attack it and destroy it. And this is a strategy that could be pursued potentially, if Iran is able to develop Russian shelter in a very credible way for its nuclear program, in the event that there's no follow-on to the JCPOA or in the future, there may be sort of a scenario where if Russia decides it's in its interest to allow Iran to develop nuclear weapons, you can Putin or whoever succeeds him can introduce the risk of sort of a direct conflict between the U.S. and Russia if the U.S. threatens to attack Iranian facilities militarily. You can imagine in certain American administrations tolerating a Saudi nuclear program or a UAE nuclear program. Turkey could potentially try to develop shelter from either Russia or the United States, depending on its relationship with NATO, if it decided it needed nuclear weapons in the face of a nuclear or a hedged Iran. And so shelter pursuit is certainly a strategy still available to states, and the U.S. has extended shelter in the past, but has to live with the consequences of essentially allowing another state out of the nuclear barn. And in the future, should the U.S. sort of face its decision point about whether to extend shelter to a potential proliferator, one has to ask the question whether it's willing to live with a nuclear Saudi Arabia indefinitely if it allows it to go all the way. For states that can't cultivate that shelter, the final strategy is the one that I think is going to dominate the coming decades, and that's hiding, clandestine nuclear programs. These are the states that face high threat, but the very threats that motivate a nuclear program are the same ones that can kill the state, the regime, or the nuclear program itself. And so these states like Iraq, Saddam's Iraq in the 1980s, South Africa, have no choice but to develop covert and clandestine nuclear programs. And we tend to associate that with sort of uranium enrichment because you can hide enrichment facilities. But the counterexample I always give to those who say this has to be sort of, centrifuges in a mountain, Syria 2007. Assad attempts to essentially obfuscate and hide a replica of what we all believe to be the Yongbyon reactor in the hinterland of Syria, comes really close until the Israelis destroy it. There was no evidence of an active reprocessing facility, but there was, I think, widespread agreement in the IC and in Israel that the purpose of that reactor was simply to produce fissile plutonium for a nuclear weapons program. And so, the hiders can adopt a variety of potential pathways and strategies, but the real sort of aim of the hiding strategy is to present a fait accompli of a nuclear weapons program before the threat that can kill the program is able to do so. And I think what's going to dominate sort of the future landscape of proliferators are hedgers, potentially hidden and clandestine hedgers, and hiders who decide that they want nuclear weapons and try to hide the program and attempt to present a fait accompli before they're discovered. And so these strategies are still, relevant as we sort of confront a cascade of potential proliferation in the coming years and decades. And one of, I think, the most concerning conclusions from the book is, especially for some of the states that might pursue nuclear weapons in the future, they may have hidden hedges that where, and we may not know when they have decided to potentially pursue nuclear weapons. So knowing, and identifying when a state has gone from hedging to an active hiding strategy may be very difficult. But this sort of raises all sorts of policy challenges for the U.S. as we confront sort of a growing number of hedgers, potential hiders, sheltered pursuers, and just a sheer number of nuclear weapon states, both adversaries, allies, and those in the middle. So I call them friends, foes, and frenemies who might be pursuing nuclear weapons is probably higher than we've seen at any time since the early Cold War. And so there's a whole chapter on sort of policy implications. Counterproliferation tends to get a bad name, but oftentimes uh, tools like sabotage, if necessary, active counterproliferation, as in the Syrian case, but also diplomacy, right? I mean, one of the virtues of the JCPOA in its initial incarnation was it did not eliminate Iran's intent to potentially pursue nuclear weapons, but it allowed sort of the international community time to detect if Iran had acted on that intent and built in buffers to give it, sort of diplomacy a chance, uh, to stop Iran before it reached the finish line. And so the suite of tools sort of available to the U.S. are well known, but they're going to be increasingly important as we go forward and confront this new nuclear era. So I'm going to stop there. Those are some of the highlights of the book. I hope you all, sort of are interested enough to read it. Feel free to ever send me emails telling me where I'm wrong about everything. I'm always happy to receive them. And at least for now, I look forward to any questions or comments you might have.